Thanks, Pierre, for inviting me again. So just checking, well, how long was it before when I gave the first lecture? And it's about 6 months ago. So, and I'm aware that you recorded the previous lecture. So I will try not to repeat anything. I might, repeat maybe 10% of it, but generally I try to include new stuff. So I just called, with the same title, Architectonics from Artificial Minds 2. So so generally the kind of work that I do cuts across different contexts, but today I'll talk a few more recent projects, including the Singapore Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale, which just opened last week or so. Yep. For those who are interested, there are a number of books that you can look into. I think the second edition is out by Milich. But yeah, so forthcoming ones, the first two, I think, well, the second one is out, is in Mandarin. But the English version will be out in the Architecture Intelligence special issue, which is probably next month, I think. But there are many other ones that is already being, I've sent all the drafts, and they should be out in the next maybe 2 or 3 months. Yep. So also quite recently, the SUTD, which is the university that I'm based at, sort of re-pivoted its direction. I mean, it is also, so the university is called Singapore University of Technology and Design, and the whole university is sort of re-pivoting after starting a bachelor degree program, which is essentially Bachelor of Science in Design and AI 5 years ago. And this year it went sort of full-fledged into transforming the entire curriculum into a design AI curriculum. So everyone in the university will be doing sort of design AI, which is kind of a more specific way of thinking about AI. So the school is pushing quite hard on this. Also quite just last week, when is it? 10 days ago, we had our opening at the Singapore Pavilion, and I'll show some project. In fact, Professor Christoph was there as well at the opening. So I'll talk about, I try to frame the presentation into 3 parts. Within each part, I will showcase some projects that might be relevant. But generally is this idea, the first one will be explicit representation learning. So it's really an investigation of how one could encode and decode architectural information. Architectural information in sort of a broader sense, in terms of its voxel representation, its text, its images, its volumetric or graph representation, right? So a kind of a decision to be made of how best or how more effectively to encode such information, to vectorize it for the machine. The second part will be implicit perception prediction, which comes much closer to Pierre's research, which is on neuroarchitecture, neuroaesthetics, on doing brainwave measurements and how it relates to the perception of space, the generation of form, which I call it a measure of attention or inattention. The last one, which is complicit form generation, has to do with my increasing interest in the reasoning aspect and also the unreasoning aspect of AI systems. So I would sort of just bear these 3 sections in mind as I cover the rest of the presentation. So the first one, explicit. So if you recall, back in the 60s, Lionel March, a prolific mathematician, architect, he wrote the book on the architecture of form. But essentially, it is about he was basically trying to represent architecture form with numbers. And back then, so this image on the right show the Seagram building. And he essentially is actually beyond just a voxel of 0 and 1. Actually then construct it as kind of a hexadecimal representation. But the slight problem of it is that every building would have a different length of digits to represent the form, which obviously in AI speak would not be exactly useful, but obviously back then it was not referring to AI. It's really trying to encode architecture information. So an example, for instance, is that imagine you have the Villa Savoye, and imagine we were to encode every single wall as an edge of a graph, every single endpoints of a wall or a column as a node. Theoretically, we could encode the Villa Savoye literally as a graph, and every edge has an attribute that represents, say, a glass panel, or every node has an attribute that again represent different architectural components. So with that, one could already begin to train, say VAE that learns the reduced compressed representation of that graph, and then you can then do reconstruction or generation. So I've shown some, as I mentioned, I might show 10% of what I've shown previously, but I would recommend you referring to the video recording from the previous session, or rather previous term. So this project, which I will just play a bit and then I'll move on because I presented it previously. But the idea here is, this is quite an old project, but was quite sort of a few of the projects that try to encode volumetric form, architectural form, with hierarchical representation boxes for a generative adversarial network, which is again a model, because it is actually more scalable as you encode it hierarchically, where you could represent the whole building in full 3 dimension, including interior and exterior. And so this is just a latent wall from that model has been trained, and because in 3D you can just cut a section wherever you want and you actually see the interior. So the data sets came from 5,000 plus public housing, high-rise, high-density building in Singapore. And also here is just showing the initial EDA, the exploratory data analysis of the data set to ensure that there is a good diversity of training data points. So these are actual building, and then used for the numbers below represent geolocation of the models of the actual building, right? And so maybe just in fact there are semantic information. Every voxel has a semantic meaning, whether is it a lift core, whether is it a corridor, whether is it a apartment, and then within it a differentiation of the architectural components. These are some of the models. But today I'll talk a bit more on the more recent papers. This one on the left is, if you like, kind of auto-completion. Instead of completing a sentence, you complete a volumetric massing of a model. Again, every volume, every voxel has a semantic label to it. And then on the right is also a more recent paper on training a variational graph autoencoder that again represent the floor plans with a graph representation. So the building GNN essentially is this whole process of training, unlike the other project that I've showed, the Air Sampling Singapore project, which was based on real physical, real building data set. In this case, it's based on a syntactic data set. But through this, the whole idea is to figure out, formulate a method. So here, imagine you train a model by sometime masking different parts of the volume, and after a while, it's able to then predict the neighbors, or rather the next token. In this case, a volumetric token. This combination of graph neural network and also GRU, which is kind of a recurrent neural network-based approach. And because it's based on GRU, every iteration, this is the ground truth in the last column, and it sort of completes it. So you could actually mask it with different percentages as a training set. This one is to be presented in Hong Kong in July at the CAD Future. Again, unlike the previous project, which is restricted by its scalability, meaning the number of possible voxels and neighborhoods. In this case, the ambition of this project is that given any building, it would do an automatic extraction of its graph from the building in 3D. And then it would then generate, we then train a model that could then reconstruct or generate novel ones with that information. So here, just a quick a video that shows the SUTD. And the whole process is that given that 3D form and also the semantics, we could use the process of, in this case, showing the 4 vertical circulation, the lift and stairs. And then we populate it by sampling points, and then to do kind of the trace in order to then extract a simpler graph representation that is more ingestible by the model. So here, for instance, every node represents a space, every edge represents the connection between space. Here, the ellipsoid ellipse is just a kind of a convenient way to represent the space and its orientation. Actually, it's kind of inspired by the use of ellipsoid in 3D-GESS, which is 3D Gaussian splatting. Here, showing the data split, and then also trying to understand the distribution. In this case, just a PCA visualization. And then you could then generate directly. Yeah, I mean, still not perfect at all, but it is sort of the ambition to not be restricted by orthogonal forms. Yeah. So just a quick some slides showing the different models. You will see it from paper once it's published in July. And this project been started last year and ongoing is again trying to, just like every image has a caption. In the case of MVRDV, they have a very strong vocabulary like this, right? They have a way to describe a type in a sort of similar sense of typology. A set is sort of a custom type, right? They will describe some buildings as sloped, pixel, stack, cluster. So the main research that we have conducted in my lab is to figure out a way to represent that information, and then allow them eventually to do a conditioning generation based on these words, and also then able to do arithmetic and interpolation between these forms. So one of the things that's been done is to use the sign distance function, which is a very clean way, a very nice way, a differentiable way to represent geometry, right? So essentially, whatever it is outside the boundary is positive, whatever it is inside is negative, whatever is at the boundary is 0. And which this diagram tries to show. So the advantage of SDF obviously is unlike a voxel, which is, well, it is simple to implement, but it's highly compute. It consumes lots of resource. And every time you train a model, you have to take into consideration of its resolution. Whereas in this case, it is an implicit representation of the form. And therefore, it allows us to in a more agile way, to learn in 3 dimension. So, for instance, in this case, we test a number of models. This is just the earlier ones. Given an autoencoder decoder neural network architecture, so this is the ground truth. In fact, we got the data set from NVIDIA next team, and then we sort of then went ahead with the design of the neural network architecture and the training. So here is just showing an example of the building categories, the pixel categories from NVIDIA. In this case, this is showing the SDF version of the ground truth, which is in order to just compare apple with apple, right? And this is how they look like, and then reconstruction. So they have this category called the cuts. And here again showing this is the comparison between the reconstructed pixel family and the original family. It's still very much in progress, but the idea here is that we could do interpolation because we could then, once we could encode any geometry, in this case with SDF, we could then, given any particular point that latent space, we can then do interpolation, which is essentially sampling along that line in the latent space. So for instance, this is kind of a simple illustration. What does it mean to interpolate? In fact, what you saw just now for the AI Sampling Singapore project is essentially kind of a latent interpolation, but without a categorical description, right? So yeah, I'm just going to run quite quickly. This project, which I will run very quickly as a video, is again trying to encode explicitly how best to represent a space. Here, for instance, given any bin models, we would then extract its graph. First, we reformat it in kind of a JSON format, and then we use that. But the whole point of this project is not so much to design or to generate new design, is to do is to solve the problem of agent-based simulation when you want to evaluate the mobility of a given space, where you find any sort of bottleneck within a given floor plan. So this is a project, 2.5 years project with the Urban Redevelopment Authority in Singapore, and what they want actually is essentially to, if any architect were to submit a plan, design development plan, and they want to quickly check their compliance, but also anticipate the probable likely mobility problem within, because usually you have to do a simulation with 6 hours, but they want to have it within under 5 minutes. And therefore, it was necessary to train a model, a graph neural network model, to then predict with the likely attributes value of a particular node in the graph, which is in this case a proxy of the building, very quickly. So next, the implicit perception prediction measure of attention and intention is sort of interested in the idea that this whole idea of the active inference is really trying to reduce the loss between what we are seeing and what we assume we ought to be seeing. But yeah, so just to show some examples that have been done in my lab and also with my students. So imagine again you have a reservoir, and then what if we could kind of find what this is more like a personalized AI model. I would train a model that could then predict the likelihood of where you'll be looking at given a 3D model. So if you think about it, it is actually a kind of a point cloud segmentation problem, right? You want to find which are the points that represent the highest saliency or attention. It's like a three-dimensional attention map. So this been carried out, and I'll show. But this is kind of the setup. This is the older system that been used for this project. In my lab, we have a new system which allows you to measure more stuff. But here, simply, you have the EEG cap, where you could then measure the brain signals. You have the eye tracking, in this case, a desktop, which is sort of facing you. We also actually have kind of sunglasses looking like eye tracking glasses. If you go outdoor to do it. So this is the kind of the setup. So there are many basic stuff that one could already identify to understand valency, arousal, or pleasure or disgust, let's say, by just measuring the asymmetry in the frontal part of the brain. And we could represent that information also with spectrogram. So this is a project that try to do it in 3 dimensions with a combination of HoloLens. So here, directly attached it and connected with the HoloLens. These are the signals. So the user are sort of playing, kind of observing the object in 3 dimensions, because we could calculate the ray ray tracing and ray casting of the point. We could actually figure out where they're looking at. So given a 3D object, we represent it as a point cloud, and then given that, we want to know which are the points that should be given a saliency value. So if I look at it long enough, it should get a higher value. And if it triggers certain, let's say, pleasure in the EEG, then I'll also grant it a higher value. So here, what you see is that, I mean, the model is not very well trained. Therefore, it's not, perfectly accurate at all. But this is the current state. So you have the eye tracking, the ET ground truth, and the predicted one. And you have the EEG ground truth and the predicted one. So here is just telling you, so if everyone has their own avatar, we could actually train your personalized AI model that would tell us where you look at for any objects or architectural space. But now we have been working on a more advanced device, which is an AR device that synchronizes exactly with the brain waves. Actually, not just the brain waves, also the EMG, the EXG, EOG, EDA. So you have like 10 channels, 10 nodes to measure EEG, and 4 for EMG. And then we have a Vargio XR3 to sort of also allow you to look at real objects or VR objects. Over here I sort of listed 4 channels for EMG. So in that sense, you could kind of also measure the facial muscles, right? If I see something nice, I might smile, or I might, the muscles might adjust a bit, or also, so that's very useful. This is kind of showing, this is my lab actually, very messy, but my researcher just looking at the space, and then what you see here is that these are the different channels. Channel 9 to 18, for instance, for EEG. And then this is just showing the aggregated value. And these are different sensors in the headset. So those on the top for the brain, and then those near the face for the facial nerve muscles. So here, very quickly, just kind of a screen capture of when someone is, for that video, for instance, looking at the space and told to think that he's relaxed and he's sleepy, let's say. So that's the implicit part of the presentation. I move on to the complicit form generation, which has to do with reasoning or unreasoning. In fact, the term reasoning could be understood in many ways, right? Just like you could do deductive, inductive, abductive, analogical, that means probabilistic. There's so many ways of approaching the term reasoning. Um, I won't talk about this because I spoke about this image, this diagram previously in the last lecture, last term. But this is worth showing again, which is so the currently models are not very good with the vision language models are not very good with doing unboxing or boxing, right? Given the unfolded version, could the model simulate this process of folding it into a box? So that is almost simulation of the real world of folding. But this is interesting that I show again here because if we imagine every image has a caption, here it sort of completely contradict our expectation. So for instance, this could be understood as wrongfully made barber's chair. This could be understood as the tongue of a camel tasting rock salt. I mean, they are reasonable, but this seems unreasonable because this is, there's no ground truth to it, which I think it gives much food for thought in terms of generative capacity and creative capacity of AI models. So here is it's kind of a clarification of what AI research in the computer science and what AI research in architecture differ drastically in our conception of spatial reasoning. So often, when you look at these CS paper, when they talk about spatial reasoning, they tend to talk about this sort of question, right? Let's say, are the windows positioned to the left of the black TV? So it's about objects being placed in space and their relationship. And also quantitatively, it would therefore means, for instance, this second question, determine the distance of the fence from giraffes in the zoo relative to the camera. Quantitatively speaking, then, is about the measurement of that spatial relation. These are sort of quite explicitly provable, right? So it's often about distance. But when we do spatial reasoning in architecture, there's always this sort of underlying generativity, meaning there is kind of a design agenda when you look at the diagram, let's say. Just to have a kind of a high level understanding of the current state of things, in the Stanford report on AI, these are the 12 sort of key takeaway for 2025. But actually, two of them, the first and the last one, is particularly interesting, and I will show you the work that I've been working on. So first is the idea of having benchmarks to measure intelligence. So in my case, how do you measure or even to begin with conceptualize spatial intelligence in architecture? What does it mean to reason architecturally, to reason spatially in buildings or in the city, right? And complex reasoning remains a challenge. There's been much discussion about what is really AI, right? Or AGI. And if some claim that it is, if I mean, they have all these benchmark, for instance, right? How so like PhD level math and undergraduate level, but these are very specific, single task oriented. It sort of neglect the issue of innate human priors, which I'll talk about after showing this project. Because this project is more about the normal reasoning. This is something that we are developing in SUTD that I'm leading. Conveniently, you can call it just the SUTD design brain. But the idea here is to have have a multi-model large language model that could consume different explicit representation of architecture, or not necessarily architecture, but we're starting with architecture. And then it does that whole process of organizing and then also linking cross-domain knowledge. The beauty of human way of learning is that in the case of analogy, for instance, we are good with mapping different domains with the same concepts, right? And that is almost transdisciplinary in that sense. So you can imagine this as multiple modules, and then we do a design. Actually, the key part of the project is design reasoning. So this is the prototype interface that we've been working on. It does the standard stuff because this project is also kind of industry facing, not just kind of an academic experiment. Is to do the standard stuff, right? You could upload different multimodal files, and then you could obviously train, fine-tuned, and then maybe RAG or whatsoever. And then it produces what is needed and then measure the different design options, which is again very standard. So I'm going to play a quick video, and this then illustrate the whole idea of a transparent form of reasoning, whether that's possible and that's desirable in an architecture workflow. So here, just kind of a quick demo of, let's say if you're grabbing the in-between domain of architecture and urban planning, we could look at the site and then we could, for the sake of demonstration, generate blah 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 square meters of GFA mixed-use building block. You upload certain things, and then it generates. You could analyze the path step, which is actually crucial. So here we're creating a tree of reasons. In AI speak, they call it chain of thoughts, tree of thoughts. But here is that what if you could have different actors? Actors meaning human designers, non-human designers, and you sort of create this whole tree where you can go back in time. So in that sense, it's making that whole decision process transparent as much as possible, and therefore consensus. So if you imagine, I mean, this is one of the earliest experiment where you given here's just showing a process, right? I type something, I generate something, right? So it is progressively generating a tree. Of course, behind this is a kind of agent-based approach. Behind it actually is an LLMs, and then you could do bifurcation and branching, and then go back. So here is so we try to inform so-called the meta representation. And to illustrate more clearly, is that imagine you have the gray box represent the human, the green box represent the AI. So there are certain tasks that humans are good at, certain tasks that AI would be faster, obviously. So we then not so much to split the work, but strategically organize our roles. And so once we have that tree of process or data flow, we could begin to swap responsibilities or grant greater agency to another designer or another AI model, and eventually able to also backtrack. Almost like a version control, but in this sense, there are many actors, of which among them are the AI agents, each of them trained with specific abilities. So coming back so this is sort of the idea of a kind of a transparent reasoning process being illustrated. But what does it mean to benchmark reasoning or intelligence beyond the linguistic? So we are familiar with this Raven's progressive matrices, which I think in the even before, this is a revised order, right? 1956, at least in this version, is it's actually a non-verbal test to assess an individual's reasoning and problem-solving abilities without the need of language. And it actually comes close to analogical reasoning, which is one of my sort of key interests currently. Um, it's also a way to assess abstract thinking. So what you have here is that you have this thing, you're supposed to guess what should be the fourth one or the sixth. Usually it's like a matrix, right? An array of images. And this is crucial. If AI system can do that, it means that it could formulate relationships without being told. And then in that sense, it can also cross domain, right? Just like you don't need to show a kid 1 million cats. You show a few, just like few shot learning, essentially, right? Show the kid a few cats, and then you will understand because you could formulate that cats are quite similar to dogs and also similar to leopards, right? In different ways. But once the AI could learn that relationship, then is sort of a kind of a good step. And also, I've been also looking at other earlier experiments like the Bongard problems, which is also trying to learn given two sets of images. The idea here is to learn the mapping, right? What are they representing, right? So in this case, it's triangles. This is about circles. So it also require you what to consider as noise, right? So here the key idea is the shape, not the hatching, not the dots, not the dash. And then you have the more currently, 2019, for instance, you have the ARC, which is dash AGI, which is essentially the same kind of test in a way, but to test AI, to benchmark them. And so it's called ARC because it has to do with abstract and reasoning to learn relationship. So in fact, there's already ARC AGI 2, and even Melanie Mitchell wrote a paper 2 years ago about concept ARC, which is this whole idea to benchmark abstract reasoning and huge kind of quite a big focus on analogy. So what been done is that at SUTD, we've actually created a new benchmark data set currently under review for AI conference, which consists about 1,500 data points, is to ask kind of this sort of question, right? So here, for instance, if I were to ask a non-architect or an architect, a human or a non-human, the answers can be quite different. For architecturally trained people, this is the interlace, right, by OMA. And you could easily answer this question, right? It's basically increasing the surface area for the green terraces and therefore more sustainable. And in this paper that we are also presenting in July in Hong Kong, which is a precursor of this other paper that we have also submitted and under review, that we have measured with half a dozen of vision language models to ask them to report what they're seeing given an architecture diagram and then to reason what they are seeing. They're generally not amazing with reasoning. So we tested with Grok, with Claude, Sonnet, with Intern, with QN, with Phi, and many others, and we see their performance. So in other words, the key interest of doing this is to understand in the future the limits of the architect and the limits of AI, which is always a moving target, right? But I think it's quite important. Someone has to do it. So one example, I mean, in this paper is that we could split it into spatial reasoning. So imagine so for instance, which of the following perspective correspond to how Jay will see Tom from his location, right? So essentially, if you are Jay, how would Tom look like and choose? There are no words in a sense. The answers are all visual. So it's testing the visual capacity, the visual reasoning capacity of the model. Or in this case, if you can only walk in anti-clockwise direction, which point can you reach the earliest from point D? So if the AI model would tend to calculate, which is what we observed in our experiment, calculate in pixel space. It would say that A is nearer, but the very fact that it has to go in an anti-clockwise, then C will be the nearest, not A. Also, we can test it with sort of an intuition of structures or lived experience. In this case, right, for instance, testing the chair is safe for a kid. I mean, once it's published, I could send you the paper, but essentially, to do that, we split it into different categories and subcategories to kind of understand. If you think about it, this whole thing is almost could be a proxy of the entire architecture curriculum in education, where you learn about structures, you learn about cultural history, you learn about form generation, you learn about fabrication. So this is the ambition, right? Of course, we start with a few papers and a few and this benchmarking data set. So for instance, the model failed terribly with GPT-4o, for instance. You couldn't actually get the correct answer. And this is yet an example of how the AI models would always calculate in pixel distance rather than conceptual distance. So here, for instance, it's saying which block is nearest to the civic building. This is a civic building. If we understand graph or a diagram that shows a graph and a legend, we know that the the block A will be nearer. But because there's a connection between civic building to block A, but no connection. Well, it's further because it will go through two spaces to get the block B. But for the AI model, it thinks this is nearer, right? So this is quite crucial. And to move on, which is the recent Venice Biennale, I'm trying to sort of marry this idea of spatial reasoning and benchmarking with analogy. So in Michael Foucault's The Order of Things, he wrote about this idea of the four similitudes, which is essentially the notion of resemblance. I mean, the argument is that resemblance play a vital role in the production of knowledge. And primo, in this case, for instance, right, convenience is based on proximity, meaning if I put something next to the other thing, they resemble each other simply because they are next to each other. They are close to each other in space. Emulation is more like a mirror if it looks like it, like similar. But analogy is more complex, just like some of the diagrams I show you, where it's a comparison and then a formulation of a relationship between objects. And sympathy is sort of empathy in the sense that this in a text is actually quite dangerous because it could potentially be homogenizing every single relationship as being the same. Therefore, it has this, if I remember correctly, anti-sympathy, which is this counter force to avoid homogenization of resemblance of all objects. But anyway, so the focus here is analogy. And in this Denali project, for instance, I trying to work on a very simple experiment. So anyways, this if you happen to be in Venice, you can check out the Singapore Pavilion. The chairs, if you were there last week or the week before, you would have seen the chairs because there was some shipping problem and it only arrived today. And then this picture is literally what I got today from the docent who took the pictures. So the pavilion is about dining. So designing as dining, sitting as sighting as sitting, planning as paleting. So the idea is to sort of bridge this different domains, right? Metaphorically, analogically speaking, right? And so the exhibition is about a dining table and its objects. So in a way, the kind of two different kinds of AI, well, of which one would it be a subset of it, potentially analogical intelligence, right? So here, because it's a dining table, what been created for the pavilion is to create the analogical reasoning for the model to see that this particular food, which is a traditional, we call it kueh in Singapore, this sort of glutinous or layered cake, meal prep kind of thing, and also this sort of glutinous rice kind of thing, where uh, if the model could reach to reference the building, which these are some of the iconic buildings in Singapore, and these are all 3D printed in this AI food generation project. Um, so in this case, for instance, what was done is to ask the given images of the food, this one, we ask the model to deconstruct it architecturally, meaning what are the architectural composition, what are the material distribution, possible structural logic, and we use that as the architectural principle to then ask the model to then AI model to then generate a building. So therefore, the very fact that this look like this and this is not because it's been decided. It was actually generated directly from this loose analogical relationship by the model. Possibly because this iconic art science museum by SUTD is all over the internet. So therefore, maybe that's why it's easy for the model to capture that. Same thing for the golden mile, right? Where you have the 1,000-layer cake, which is kind of a Indonesian influence Malay cake. So we've done a whole series of them, in fact, and now exhibited on at the Singapore Pavilion on that dining table, where we try. I mean, in a way, it's sort of the way to think about the architecture, the taxonomy of the food, the kuehs, we call it kuehs, and the taxonomy of architecture form. So it's interesting that without someone being trained in architecture or even having any pretext, it's surprising that many people could immediately understand the analogy. So this is done by Foster. This is by David Libinsky. This is standard HDB housing in Singapore, public housing. And so paletting. So in this case, I also created a miniature version because it's just pure fun. And then also postcards as part of the exhibition. So as I said, so these are the miniature ones, and they're original a specific way actually, almost like the grid light system of Delirious New York, where you have the buildings. But so these are the Kueh pieces. Actually, one of them is the SUTD building, which is designed by UN Studio. So here is just an example. So given you make the language model to analyze, to decompose, and then to then generate a Singapore architecture. For in this case, we're trying to find that relationship, right? The latent space of Kueh and architecture, AI generation of Kueh. Earlier experiments, some are less successful, some are more successful. So here is that learning from the food themselves, architecturally speaking, right? So these are the different lapis means layers in Malay. Bacang is actually Chinese, so it's this kind of Chinese Malay culture, which is Peranakan, which is also called Noya, and they create this rice dumpling. So anyway, the project is trying to have AI generative work that are hopefully increasingly more culturally sensitive, relevant, useful, provocative. So these are the food version, and these are the architecture that's been sampled from what the model could see of Singapore. So if we were to decompose the entire food, the entire kueh, you could see this is how human would compare it compositionally, formally, right? You have, the fingers, they're similar to the Art Science Museum. You have the columns, you have the podium like this glass hall. But in reality, the model doesn't really think that way, unless you choose to explicitly encode it. As I mentioned, this is a food project that's been going on for 1.5 years, just that we chose to showcase this recent experiment at the Biennale. So in this image is just showing printing of yen. Anyway, so designing as dining. So in the exhibition, it's also trying to show the analogy of dining, obviously inspired by Sarah Wigglesworth dining table project from the 90s, where she traces the actions within at the dining table as a way to understand domesticity, right? Uh, where you could understand the use of a house, and then she then uses it to generate a house plan. So here is just this analogical reasoning of the Gui dining and the Esplanade, and also many other ones. So these are actually all shown with the projection mapping at the Singapore Biennale. Sorry, the Venice Biennale for the Singapore Pavilion. There are moments where, I mean, if you see the video, you could obviously see, I mean, there are reasons why the fingers are left there. Even if you do negative prompting, the fingers still sort of sneak in, which is actually quite interesting. So you see the relationship between different food, and this is the Raffles Hotel, also the non kueh. So this is hot pot, very popular in Asia. And there are instances where the fingers appear when it's not supposed to appear, which is this transgression of the supposed targeted domain, in this case, architecture. There are more here, for instance, the favorite dining breakfast in Singapore, the half-boiled egg and toast bread, and also durian, if you're familiar with durians. Yeah, so these are, I mean, fun to do. But crucially is this interest in the notion of resemblance and how that could grant us a way to think about or even understand the architectural intelligence, the intelligence of the architect. This neural monoblock black project are the chairs actually that only arrived today in Venice, instead of arriving 2 weeks ago. So is again, because it's a national pavilion, the interest is you have the dining table, you have social dining. So essentially, social dining as participatory city planning. That's at least the metaphor of the whole pavilion. And you have all these chairs, which you will, if you ever visited Singapore, you would see all these monoblock chairs, which are essentially injection mold plastic chairs in many of the coffee shops. These are called coffee shops in Singapore. And the project is to look at potential I call it neurotectonics, meaning the capacity of models to generate 3D, having only seen 2D images of these objects. So you get this strange hypercubist, multi-faced chairs, which in fact increases their seating affordances. So the first time it was exhibited was last year at the National Design Center. And this is how it looks like now, as of today, in Venice. There are moments where so to sort of again further reinforce the idea that it's a dining space. There's a quick feed. Oh, there's a quick video here. So these are, so it's obviously a contrast, right? It's a critical project in the sense that it's a critique of mass production of the white plastic chair, right? So it's not white, it's black. It's not surface-based, it's volumetric. It's not mono-function optimized. It has great sort of redundancy. It's not made of plastic, it's made of upcycled teak wood. It's not digitally fabricated. It's artisan, made by artisans. So it's this kind of a critique of the process. So here is just a simplified version. It's always quite difficult to explain, say, this chair is kind of a hypercubist chair. So for the sake of clarification or ease of understanding, you could imagine that a model has only seen the monoblock chair, these plastic chairs, from specific views, and when you force them to synthesize it in the three-dimensional object, you create this sort of a glitch. Just like in early days, when you try to generate with text to image a panda, you get like 3 eyes and 4 ears on the head of the panda. And because of that, they also create interesting visual affordances as you move through the space. So this is just a floor plan of the National Design Center, not the pavilion, in case it's misleading. Went through many early experiments. So this is actually how they look like in their rawest state. You see, sometimes there's weirdness here, right? Because the model, when it sees a stack of monoblock plastic chairs, it thinks that there's this really long leg, but actually it consists of multiple chairs, and the model just, got confused, and that makes it actually quite interesting. And I know I should wrap up soon, but some teaching. So in SUTD, I teach in the both programs, the Architecture Sustainable Design program and also the Design AI program. So one with architecture students, one without with non-architecture student. This is with architecture student, second year student. So so in this project, for instance, I make students to kind of explore sites of interest. In this case, the students, the team, are interested in objects, the ontology of objects, and whether one could have a deeper understanding of how objects could occupy or rather take over architecture. Like these sort of antique shops. So in this case, the segment anything model to just extract the objects, but of course it's an image, so certain objects been occluded, and the idea here is to grant the object a certain degree of agency. So here I'll show you a video. Is to say, given a patch of the image, those objects should influence the behavior of the other object in the other cell. And we could then orchestrate a whole kind of interaction, right? So for instance, this flower pot, this watering thing, flask, that we're trying to do sort of an object network, almost in a kind of Latour sense, right? The actor network theory, in the sense that every object could have a certain agency given by the model. So this is a quick video. If you were to split this into parts, sorry, it should run though. Okay, maybe this one. Oh, actually, hold on. The video. This should be the video, no? Okay, maybe not. Sorry, I missed adding the video. Maybe it's somewhere else. But anyway, I just run this other one. So this project is trying to give a different take on street views, with synthetic street view, and every building has a kind of an audio signature. Maybe the temple. I hope you can hear the sound. Maybe some conserved heritage building, and in that process, it is sort of an unfolding of a synthetic street in Singapore. They look familiar. There are certain deliberate glitches that's made by a student to, you know, to show hints of its artificiality, and its gradual graying out into monotony. I mean, this is easy to do with AI tools, but it's more about the concept and how one could use these tools for, different new way, alternative ways of thinking about architecture and the city. So bear in mind, these are second year students in architecture. Um, this video is quite long, but I just show some of it. So there is this place in Singapore called Haw-Par-Villa, which is a very, I think it's on the 70s, and has things like this. So it's about the Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, about hell, about heaven, about gods and devils. Uh, and so students actually went ahead and scanned all the objects and run them against agencies. But they also create paths of, ways to hell. Because eventually at the end of the whole theme park is hell. At the end, whether you take, of course, this is in this project, for instance, the student take is that whichever path you take is the progress, is not the end point, whether it's Buddhism, Taoism, or Confucianism. So these are some of the story. I mean, these AI systems are very good with, you can play with storyline and to generate different kind of actions. So this is very quite long, but I'll just go through quickly.
Villa, many don't know that amidst the history and
I hope you can
culture,
hear this,
there
the
lies
narration.
one precious secret: how to escape hell. There are 3 paths you can take to successfully avoid hell: Confucianist, Buddhist,
You
and
guys here,
Taoist.
actually? I know the time is running out, so I'm just gonna go quickly. It's essentially telling a story
You see?
of different ways from the Monkey King to the West to the Laughing Buddha. Is them creating this storytelling essentially. That's the task for this course to use these AI system for creating new stories with a site specific.
Time.
And then critique of AI. So this student, they work on typology of playground, of the increasing standardization of playground as so they start off with the 1960s and then 2020s. They 3D scan all the playgrounds and they create a narrative, which I know I've been told to leave 30 minutes for the Q&A, but essentially a child that, all these are synthetic, that imagine his life and then how he experienced the playground and his imagination of what each of these things represent. And the story goes like, increasingly just like compliances in architecture, the playground gets safer and safer and increasingly less fun. And then the boy is crying, and then eventually become a very abstract playground. The boy could still imagine, but eventually the playground just reduce in its play affordances by simply being, very simple like this. So anyway, yeah, okay, exceeded 5 minutes. So if you're interested, there are many publications that you can read, and I'll just drop me an email. Right, thanks.